My parents changed the locks on my luxury penthouse and moved my sister in while I was away on a business trip. They looked me dead in the eye and told me to hand over my home because I was single and she deserved it more. I smiled, let them enjoy the music, and then dropped the absolute bombshell that I had already sold the entire property to a corporate landlord. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to legally outsmart toxic family members to protect your peace. My name is Natalie. I am 34 years old, and I work as a senior actuary calculating financial risks for major corporations. I am trained to spot liabilities, but for a long time, the biggest blind spot in my risk assessment was my own family. It was a freezing Tuesday evening in November when I finally returned to Chicago. I had just survived a grueling month-long audit in London. My body was completely exhausted, running on airplane coffee and sheer willpower. All I wanted was to drag my luggage into my $950,000 condo, take a hot shower in my custom stone bathroom, and sleep for 2 days straight. I rolled my suitcase down the quiet carpeted hallway of my building, shivering slightly from the winter chill still clinging to my wool coat. I reached the heavy mahogany door of Unit 42, naturally raising my hand to tap my thumb against the biometric smart lock. My finger hit bare wood. I blinked, stepping back to look closer. The sleek black keypad I had installed last year was completely gone. In its place, someone had drilled a jagged hole and shoved in a cheap, flimsy brass deadbolt that looked like it belonged on a budget motel door. Splinters of expensive wood were still scattered on my welcome mat. I froze. For a second, I thought I was on the wrong floor. I checked the brass numbers. 4, 2. This was my home. Then I heard it, a heavy rhythmic bass thumping through the walls. It was so loud the floorboards beneath my boots were vibrating. Someone was throwing a massive party inside my apartment. A cold wave of adrenaline washed over my exhaustion. I did not panic, and I did not pound on the door like a madwoman. Actuaries do not act on emotion. We gather data. I grabbed my suitcase, turned around, and walked swiftly down the hall to the freight elevator. As the owner of the penthouse, I had a master fob that granted me access to the private service entrance attached to my kitchen pantry. I swiped the fob. The heavy metal door clicked open. The moment I stepped inside, the smell of cheap weed-stale beer and overwhelming artificial vanilla air freshener hit me like a physical blow. I pushed past the pantry doors and walked into my own kitchen, stopping dead in my tracks. My sanctuary had been completely vandalized. My living room, which I had meticulously designed with a minimalist aesthetic, was unrecognizable. My custom white Italian leather sofa, a piece I had saved up for months to purchase, was simply gone. It had been entirely removed. In its place sat 3 massive, hideous neon green beanbag chairs arranged in a sloppy circle on top of a cheap shedding faux fur rug. The calming, neutral walls I loved were now plastered with bright pink LED strip lights held up by thick strips of clear tape that were definitely peeling off the expensive paint. Dozens of strangers were crammed into my living space, spilling cheap red wine onto my hardwood floors. And right in the center of the chaos, standing on top of my imported marble kitchen island in her bare feet, was my 29-year-old sister Cassidy. She was wearing a tight sequined dress, holding up a plastic cup and slurring her words as she gave a toast to her wonderful new life. Standing right beside her, encouraging the cheering crowd, was her husband, DeAndre. DeAndre was 32, an aspiring crypto entrepreneur who loved to project the image of massive wealth. He wore a fake gold chain and leased luxury cars he absolutely could not afford, constantly dodging calls from debt collectors. At this exact moment, he was holding a bottle of my vintage reserve champagne, the bottle I had bought in Paris to celebrate my promotion. He gripped the cork, shaking the bottle vigorously, preparing to spray it all over my ceiling. I stood frozen in the shadow of the hallway, my knuckles turning white around the handle of my suitcase. Then DeAndre popped the cork. The champagne sprayed everywhere, soaking the walls. As the crowd cheered, DeAndre turned his head, wiping the foam from his eyes. His gaze landed on me standing perfectly still by the refrigerator. His arrogant smile did not waver. Instead, it grew wider. He pointed the dripping bottle directly at me and shouted over the deafening music for the entire room to hear. "Look who decided to crash our housewarming. Welcome to our new crib, sis." The music seemed to amplify in the heavy silence that followed DeAndre's announcement. Dozens of eyes shifted from the dripping champagne bottle to me expecting a screaming match. They expected the angry, hysterical woman whose home had just been invaded. I did not give them the satisfaction. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the icy calm of my profession take over. I walked forward, my leather boots clicking softly against the hardwood floor, cutting through the tense atmosphere. I moved past the hideous green beanbags and stepped right up to the marble kitchen island. Cassidy wobbled slightly on the marble surface, clutching her plastic cup, her fake smile faltering as I approached. I did not yell. I did not curse. I simply unhooked my designer bag from my shoulder and set it down on the counter with a soft, deliberate thud. I looked DeAndre directly in the eyes. He was still holding my vintage champagne, the foam dripping onto his cheap sneakers. I extended my right hand toward him. "Pour me a glass, DeAndre," I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "Since you are celebrating in my kitchen, it is only polite that the host gets a drink." DeAndre blinked, completely thrown off balance by my lack of outrage. He opened his mouth to retort, but before he could form a sentence, the door to the master bedroom swung open. My master bedroom. Out stepped my parents, Richard and Brenda. My mother was adjusting her cardigan, holding a small plate of appetizers, looking as comfortable as if she were in her own suburban home. My father followed closely behind her, laughing at a joke someone had just made. They had completely taken over my personal space. When my mother saw me standing at the island, her face instantly hardened. The cheerful hostess persona vanished, replaced by the familiar scowl of deep disappointment I had known my entire life. She shoved her plate into my father's hands and marched across the living room. She did not welcome me home. She did not ask about my flight or the stressful audit I had just finished in London. Instead, she reached out and tightly grabbed my forearm, her nails digging slightly into my coat sleeve. "Natalie, what on earth are you doing here?" she hissed under her breath, trying to keep her voice low so the guests would not hear. "You were supposed to be in Europe until next week." I looked down at her hand, gripping my arm, then back up to her face. "I live here, Mom," I replied calmly. "This is my apartment." My mother rolled her eyes dramatically, pulling me harder toward the hallway, away from the prying eyes of DeAndre's friends. "You are making a scene and ruining your sister's big night," she scolded, her tone sharp and condescending. She dragged me into the dimly lit corridor near the guest bathroom. "You always have to make everything about yourself, do you not?" I stood tall, forcing her to look up at me, making it about myself. I came home from a month-long business trip to find my locks changed, my furniture missing, and a frat party happening in my living room. Brenda let go of my arm and crossed her arms over her chest, taking on a defensive, righteous posture. "We are family, Natalie," she said, as if that word was a magic spell that excused grand larceny. "You are 34 years old and completely single. You work 80 hours a week and you are constantly traveling for business. Leaving a massive 3-bedroom penthouse empty is just selfish and wasteful. Cassidy is expecting a baby in 5 months. She and DeAndre need a real place to raise their child. DeAndre needs a proper home office to get his new business off the ground." She gestured toward the living room where the music was still blaring. "You have more money than you know what to do with. You should be happy to step up for your family. You are the older sister. It is your duty to make sure Cassidy is taken care of. You can easily afford to rent a small studio apartment closer to your firm. This place is just too big for one lonely woman." Her words hung in the air, heavy with absolute entitlement. I glanced past her shoulder right into the living room. Several of DeAndre's loud friends had their phones out, recording the confrontation for their social media followers, hoping for some juicy family drama. I turned my attention back to my mother and let a slow, very genuine smile spread across my face. "I see," I said softly to her. "So whose name is on the mortgage you expect me to keep paying?" Before my mother could sputter out a ridiculous defense, heavy footsteps approached from the hallway. My father Richard pushed past Brenda, his chest puffed out like he was the undisputed king of my castle. He did not say a word at first. He simply reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a folded stack of thick paper, and slammed it down onto the marble island with a loud smack that echoed loudly over the fading music. I looked down at the document. Printed at the very top in bold black letters were the words, "Quitclaim Deed, Illinois State Registry." My eyes quickly scanned the legal text. It was a legally binding document transferring the sole ownership of my property, my penthouse, to Cassidy and DeAndre. The purchase price listed on the contract was $1. They had actually hired a lawyer to draft this ridiculous paperwork while I was overseas working 12-hour shifts to afford the mortgage they were now trying to steal. "Sign it, Natalie," my father commanded, his voice booming so the guests in the living room could hear his authority. "You have been selfish for far too long. We are fixing this family imbalance tonight. You will sign this condo over to your sister right now, and you will do it with a smile. This family is done catering to your independence. It is the least you can do after everything I have provided for you." He turned to face DeAndre's friends, who were now openly staring and whispering among themselves. "I paid for her entire college education," he announced proudly, playing the role of the martyred father, giving everything to an ungrateful child. "I sacrificed my own retirement savings so she could succeed. I gave her the foundation to get that fancy corporate job. Now she wants to throw her pregnant sister out onto the street. Typical ungrateful behavior." I let out a sharp, genuine laugh. The sound cut entirely through his grand speech. "You paid for my college," I repeated, making sure my voice carried just as far as his did. "That is a fascinating alternate reality, Richard. Let us talk exact numbers, since I am an actuary, and numbers are my specialty. I took out high-interest federal student loans totaling $86,420. I worked night shifts at a diner off campus to cover my rent and textbooks. I made my final loan payment of $1,200 exactly 3 years ago on October 14th. You did not contribute a single dime to my education. In fact, you took $2,000 from my high school savings account to buy a riding lawnmower and never paid me back." The room grew uncomfortably quiet. My father's face flushed a deep, angry red. "How dare you speak to me like that in front of guests?" he snapped, stepping closer as if his physical presence would intimidate me into backing down. Cassidy immediately started to fake cry, burying her face in DeAndre's shoulder to play the victim. DeAndre wrapped a protective arm around her, glaring at me with pure disdain. "Man, you are just a bitter, lonely woman," DeAndre scoffed loudly, making sure his friends heard him. His buddies snickered in the background, holding up their phones, clearly enjoying the narrative of the jealous older sister ruining the vibe. "You are just mad because Cassidy found a real man to build a family with while you sit in empty rooms counting other people's money. Just sign the paper and take your miserable energy somewhere else so we can celebrate." I looked down at the quitclaim deed resting on the marble counter. Right next to it was a sleek silver pen my father had placed there, expecting me to surrender without a fight. I reached out slowly. I let my fingers hover over the cold metal of the pen, feeling the weight of their expectations. My mother let out a loud sigh of relief, her shoulders dropping. Cassidy stopped her fake crying instantly and peeked out from DeAndre's shoulder, a triumphant smirk forming on her lips. My father crossed his arms over his chest, visibly satisfied that he had successfully bullied me into submission once again. I picked up the pen. I did not move toward the signature line on the legal document. Instead, I calmly reached over, grabbed a glass of iced water someone had abandoned on the counter, and used the expensive silver pen to stir the ice cubes. The clinking sound was incredibly crisp and sharp in the completely silent room. I took a slow sip of the water, looked directly at my brother-in-law, and smiled. "DeAndre," I said clearly, making sure the camera phones caught every single syllable. "Did you tell your friends you got evicted last Tuesday because your crypto portfolio crashed, or did you skip that part?" DeAndre's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The confident smirk he had worn just seconds ago completely vanished, replaced by a look of sheer panic. He darted a nervous glance at his friends, who were now staring at him with raised eyebrows. I do not know what you are talking about, he stammered, his voice suddenly lacking its previous boom. You are crazy. We just decided to upgrade our living situation. We needed more space for the baby. Upgrade. I echoed, taking another slow sip of my ice water. That is a very creative word for getting thrown out by the sheriff. Would you like me to share the exact numbers with your buddies here, DeAndre? Because as an actuary, I have a photographic memory for financial disasters. You currently owe $45,612 across 3 maxed-out credit cards. Your leased BMW is exactly 3 months behind on payments, which means the repo man is actively looking for it right now. I paused, letting my eyes sweep across his group of friends who were now murmuring to each other. The phones that were recording just moments ago were slowly being lowered. The illusion of the wealthy crypto king was shattering in real time right in front of their eyes. And the only reason I know these highly specific numbers, I continued turning my cold gaze back to my father, who had suddenly gone very pale, is because last Thursday Richard and Brenda called me in tears. They begged me for a $15,000 loan to stop DeAndre from declaring bankruptcy. A loan they swore they would keep a secret from the rest of the family to protect your fragile alpha male ego. A collective gasp rippled through the living room. DeAndre looked like he was going to be sick. He stared at his father-in-law, his face twisting in deep humiliation and betrayal. You asked her for money, DeAndre hissed at Richard, his fake gold chain catching the light as he breathed heavily. You told me you were liquidating a municipal bond to help us out. Richard opened his mouth to defend himself, but he was completely speechless, caught dead in his own web of lies in front of a dozen strangers. Before my father could formulate an excuse, Cassidy launched her counterattack. Right on cue, the tears began to fall. Not delicate, quiet tears, but loud, heaving sobs designed to draw every ounce of sympathy in the room. She threw her arms around DeAndre, burying her face against his chest, her sequined dress shimmering under the harsh kitchen lights. Stop it, Cassidy screamed, her voice cracking perfectly for maximum dramatic effect. Why are you doing this to us, Natalie? Why are you so evil? She pulled away slightly, pointing a trembling manicured finger at me. You are just jealous. You have always been jealous of me. You sit in this giant empty penthouse all by yourself, working yourself to death, and for what? You have no husband. You have no children. Nobody loves you. You cannot stand the fact that DeAndre and I have real love and that we are bringing a beautiful baby into this world. You want to ruin my happiness because your own life is a miserable, lonely failure, and you want everyone else to be as miserable as you are. Her performance was Oscar-worthy. A few of the guests shifted uncomfortably, suddenly feeling bad for the pregnant woman crying in the middle of the kitchen. They whispered among themselves, the party atmosphere completely dead, replaced by the suffocating tension of a family imploding in public. Cassidy leaned into the murmurs, sobbing louder, expecting me to snap back with an emotional defense. She wanted me to look like the bitter, jealous spinster she was accusing me of being. I did not take the bait. I simply placed my glass of water down on the marble counter next to the ridiculous quitclaim deed. I looked at her with complete apathy. Cassidy, I said flatly, your husband is a financial parasite and you are wearing a maternity dress you bought with my credit card information that you stole 3 years ago. I am not jealous of your life. I am appalled by it. Now, all of you need to pack up this cheap trash and get out of my apartment before I call the police for criminal trespassing. That was the breaking point for my mother. Brenda could not handle seeing her golden child publicly humiliated and rejected. She slammed both of her hands down on the kitchen island, her face twisted in absolute fury. She abandoned the fake, sweet mother routine entirely, revealing the calculating manipulator underneath. That is enough, Brenda screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings and silencing the whispers of the crowd. You are not calling anyone, and nobody is leaving. You think you are so smart with your numbers and your corporate job? But you are not as smart as you think. We established residency here 3 days ago. We officially changed our mailing address with the post office. We moved furniture in. Under Illinois state law, we are legal tenants. You cannot just kick us out. DeAndre immediately seized on my mother's declaration. The mention of state law seemed to reignite his shattered confidence. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, his thumbs flying across the screen as he brought up a web page he had clearly bookmarked in advance. He held the screen up, tapping it aggressively with his index finger. "Your mother is absolutely right," DeAndre sneered, stepping away from Cassidy and puffing his chest out again. "I did my research, Natalie. You think you are the only one who knows how to read a contract?" Under the Chicago Residential Landlord and Tenant Ordinance, we have already established legal residency in this unit. He began pacing back and forth in front of the marble island, acting as if he were a high-priced defense attorney delivering a closing argument to a jury. "We changed our official mailing address with the United States Postal Service over 3 weeks ago. We have utility bills in my name currently being routed to this exact unit number. We have moved substantial personal property onto the premises. We have occupied the space continuously. According to the law, we are not trespassers. We are holdover tenants, and in the city of Chicago, the eviction courts are backed up for miles." He stopped pacing and leaned over the counter, planting both hands on the marble to get right in my face. "Even if you refuse to sign that quitclaim deed, you cannot force us to leave tonight. You cannot call the police to physically remove us. If you try, they will tell you it is a civil matter. You will have to file a formal eviction notice, serve us with papers, and wait for a court date. That process will take you anywhere from 6 to 8 months. By the time a judge finally orders us out, my baby will already be born, and I will have saved up enough money from my new business to buy a house twice the size of this overpriced shoebox. So go ahead, try to throw us out. I dare you." I did not flinch at his proximity. Instead, I looked past him, locking eyes with my parents. The sheer level of calculation required to execute this plan was staggering. This was not a spontaneous decision fueled by desperation. This was a meticulously coordinated hostile takeover of my life, orchestrated by the people who were supposed to protect me. "How did you get in?" I asked quietly, directing the question to my father. Richard crossed his arms, looking incredibly smug. "You gave us an emergency spare key 2 years ago, Natalie. In case of a fire or a medical emergency, we simply used it to let the locksmith into the building while you were stuck on your little European vacation." "It was a work trip," I corrected him flatly. "Does not matter," my father shot back, waving his hand dismissively. "The point is, you were a continent away making money you do not even need while your sister was stressing about where to put a crib. We brought Cassidy and DeAndre's boxes up through the service elevator late at night so your nosy neighbors would not complain. We scheduled the lock replacement perfectly. We even forwarded their mail starting the day your flight took off for London. We did what we had to do to protect our family since you refused to help." My mother stepped forward, her voice dripping with a sickeningly sweet tone that she always used when she was trying to justify something terrible. "Look at it logically, sweetheart. You are a smart girl. A wealthy actuary like you can afford to stay in a luxury hotel downtown for a few months while you look for a new place. You love hotels anyway. It is really the most practical solution for everyone. Just sign the paper, let Cassidy have her dream home, and we can all go back to being a happy family. If you fight this, you will just waste thousands of dollars on attorney fees, and you will still be miserable and alone." They really thought they had backed me into an inescapable corner. They had weaponized my own emergency key, tracked my international flight schedule, and abused tenant protection laws to steal my most valuable asset. The psychological warfare was intense. They wanted me to feel utterly powerless, trapped in my own kitchen, suffocated by the legal red tape they had deliberately wrapped around my neck. DeAndre's friends, who had been completely silent during the credit card revelation, began to murmur again. Some of them nodded in agreement with DeAndre's legal assessment. The party atmosphere was dead, but a new tense spectator energy had taken over. They were watching a hostile siege unfold, and they fully believed my family had just won the war. I looked down at the forged quitclaim deed, then at DeAndre's smug face, and finally at my parents' triumphant expressions. I took another slow sip of my ice water. Before I could deliver my response, a sharp, authoritative sound echoed through the apartment. It was a loud, heavy knock on the front door. Not a casual tap from a party guest, but the firm, rhythmic pounding of someone who demanded immediate entry. The murmuring in the living room stopped instantly. DeAndre frowned, looking toward the hallway. "Open up," a stern, booming voice called out from the other side of the door. "This is the president of the Homeowners Association, accompanied by building security. We have received multiple noise complaints regarding unauthorized guests in Unit 42. DeAndre smirked, clearly unfazed. He straightened his jacket, looking at me with pure arrogance. "Watch and learn, Natalie," he whispered. "I will handle the rent-a-cops." He turned on his heel and confidently marched toward the front door to defend his stolen castle. DeAndre yanked the front door open with a dramatic flourish, blocking the entryway with his broad shoulders. Standing in the hallway was Mr. Peterson, the silver-haired president of the Homeowners Association, flanked by two large, stern-looking building security guards. DeAndre immediately puffed out his chest, adopting a stance that he probably thought looked intimidating. He plastered a fake, condescending smile on his face, ready to play the role of the annoyed but compliant new homeowner dealing with petty neighborhood complaints. "Everything is fine here, gentlemen," DeAndre announced loudly, making sure his voice carried all the way back to the kitchen where his friends were watching. "We just moved in a few days ago, and my wife and I were simply having a small housewarming gathering. We will turn the music down. There is no need for all this security drama. You can go back down to the lobby." Mr. Peterson did not flinch. He did not smile back, nor did he acknowledge DeAndre's attempt at asserting dominance over the situation. Instead, the older man simply peered right over DeAndre's shoulder, his sharp eyes scanning the ruined living room. He took in the peeling neon lights, the spilled wine, and the hideous green beanbags before his gaze finally locked onto me. I was still standing perfectly still by the marble kitchen island, holding my glass of ice water. I did not say a word. I simply offered Mr. Peterson a very small, almost imperceptible nod. DeAndre noticed the exchange, and his fake smile vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine irritation. He did not like being ignored, especially not in front of an audience he was desperately trying to impress. He shifted his weight intentionally, blocking Mr. Peterson's view of me. "Listen to me, man," DeAndre said, his tone dropping into a low, aggressive register. "I told you we have it handled. My name is DeAndre, and I am the legal tenant of Unit 42. We have established residency. You have absolutely no right to come up here and harass my family. We know our rights under Illinois state law, so do not try to intimidate us with your little rent-a-cops." He turned around quickly, snatching a small stack of envelopes from the sleek entryway console table. He shoved the envelopes directly into the chest of the nearest security guard. "Look at the names on that mail," he demanded aggressively. "Go ahead, read it. That is my name and my wife's name printed right there, delivered by the United States Postal Service to this exact address. We are legally occupying this premises, and if you try to force us out without a court-ordered eviction notice, I will personally sue this building management company for everything it is worth." My parents. Richard and Brenda exchanged a look of profound satisfaction. My father even crossed his arms and nodded approvingly, clearly impressed by his son-in-law's aggressive legal bluff. Cassidy stood up from the sofa, delicately holding her stomach, playing the perfect picture of a distressed but legally protected expecting mother. They all fully believed that this piece of forwarded junk mail was an impenetrable shield. I remained completely silent. The urge to laugh was bubbling up in my throat, but I swallowed it down with another sip of water. I was letting DeAndre dig his own grave, and he was excavating it with absolute enthusiasm. He was so incredibly eager to prove his superiority that he was blindly walking right into the trap I had set. The security guard took the envelopes, looked at the names, and then handed them silently to Mr. Peterson. The HOA president adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, glancing down at the cheap forwarded mail. Then he looked slowly back up at DeAndre. The expression on Mr. Peterson's face was not anger or intimidation. It was utter, unadulterated confusion. He looked from DeAndre to my father, then finally back to me, raising an eyebrow in silent question. I maintained my neutral expression, giving nothing away. The silence in the hallway stretched out, growing heavier by the second, as DeAndre waited for the building management to back down and apologize. "Tenants," Mr. Peterson finally said, his voice echoing clearly through the dead quiet apartment. He lowered the envelopes, looking at DeAndre as if the man had just spoken a foreign language. Sir, I do not know what kind of game you are trying to play here tonight, but the governing documents of this luxury condominium association strictly prohibit any form of subletting or unauthorized tenant occupancy. DeAndre smirked, crossing his arms. Well, take it up with Natalie, he countered arrogantly. Because we are not leaving. Mr. Peterson let out a short, dry chuckle that held absolutely no humor. Take it up with Natalie, he repeated, shaking his head slowly. Sir, you clearly have no idea what is going on. Furthermore, this unit does not belong to Miss Natalie anymore. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that immediately follows a car crash. For 3 agonizing seconds, no one breathed. Then the plastic cup slipped from Cassidy's trembling fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a dull thud, splashing cheap champagne across her bare toes. She did not even flinch. She just stared at Mr. Peterson, her mouth slightly open. My father was the first to recover. The smug superiority on his face evaporated, replaced by a dark, volatile confusion. What the hell are you talking about? Richard demanded, his voice rising in panic. He pushed past DeAndre, stepping aggressively toward the HOA president. What do you mean it does not belong to her? We are her family. We know exactly what she owns. I was just looking at the property tax records last week. You are a glorified hall monitor, Peterson. Do not try to play legal games with me. Mr. Peterson did not back down. He adjusted his glasses again, his expression entirely unsympathetic. I am not playing games, Richard. I am informing you of the facts recorded by the building management. As of 48 hours ago, the deed to Unit 42 was officially transferred. I decided it was time to put them out of their misery. I set my glass of ice water down on the marble island, the sharp clink drawing every eye in the room back to me. I stepped out from behind the counter, walking slowly into the center of the living room, right past the hideous green bean bags. He means exactly what he said, I announced, keeping my voice perfectly calm and steady. I do not own this penthouse anymore. My mother let out a sharp, breathless gasp. Her hand flew to her chest as if I had physically struck her. Natalie Brenda stammered, her eyes darting frantically around the room. Natalie, what have you done? You cannot sell a home without telling your family. Where are Cassidy and the baby supposed to live? I looked at my mother, feeling absolutely nothing but cold clarity. You really should have checked the corner of the ceiling by the front door before you brought a strange man up here, Mom. I have a secondary motion-activated ring camera hidden inside the smoke detector. It operates on a separate cellular network, meaning it stayed online even after DeAndre arrogantly unplugged the main Wi-Fi router. Brenda went completely pale. The color drained from her face so fast I thought she might actually faint. 3 weeks ago, I continued addressing the silent crowd of party guests who were hanging onto my every word. I was sitting in a hotel room in London, reviewing risk projection spreadsheets. My phone buzzed with a security alert. I opened the app and watched a crystal-clear, high-definition live stream of my own mother walking a locksmith down this exact hallway. I watched you point to my door, Mom. I watched you pay him cash to drill out my smart lock and install a $50 deadbolt from a hardware store. DeAndre swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. You watched us, he whispered, his fake tough guy persona completely shattered. I watched everything. I confirmed, my gaze cutting into him. I watched you carry your garbage bags full of cheap clothes through the service elevator. I watched Cassidy drag in those ridiculous beanbags. Now a normal person might have panicked. A normal person might have immediately called the Chicago Police Department to report a break-in. But I am not a normal person, and I know exactly how this family operates. I turned to look at my father, who was staring at me with a mixture of hatred and terror. If I had called the police, Richard would have smooth-talked them. He would have played the victim, claiming it was just a simple family misunderstanding, a miscommunication about a spare key. The cops would have called it a civil matter and walked away. You would have used that time to establish exactly the kind of fake residency you are trying to claim tonight. I knew your history of financial abuse. I knew you stole my college savings. I knew you viewed my bank accounts as your personal emergency funds. I knew that fighting you in eviction court would drain my time, my energy, and my peace of mind. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over them. So I did not call the police. I called a corporate real estate broker who specializes in fast all-cash transactions for high-demand luxury properties. I signed the listing agreement electronically from my hotel room in London while you were busy rearranging my kitchen cabinets. Cassidy let out a loud, dramatic wail, clutching DeAndre's arm. "You sold our home!" she sobbed, completely delusional to the bitter end. "You sold your own nephew's home." I took one final step forward, closing the distance between myself and my parents. I looked directly into their horrified eyes and let a sharp, victorious smirk cross my face. "Mom, Dad, did you really think an actuary would not calculate the risk of leaving her assets unprotected around you?" The sheer gravity of my words finally seemed to crush whatever delusional hope they had left. My father took a step back, bumping heavily into the edge of the marble island, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound coming out. My mother simply stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and absolute terror. The party guests who just a few minutes ago were drinking my expensive champagne and laughing at DeAndre's jokes were now completely still, realizing they were standing in the middle of a massive legal catastrophe. I turned away from their stunned faces and walked back over to my designer bag resting on the counter. I slowly unzipped the main compartment, reached inside, and pulled out a thick, heavy folder bound with a black legal clip. The crisp sound of the heavy cardstock opening echoed sharply through the silent kitchen. I pulled out a stack of documents bearing the official watermark of the Cook County Assessor's Office. I dropped the heavy stack directly on top of the forged quitclaim deed they had tried to force me to sign just moments before. "Take a close look at those signatures, Richard," I offered smoothly. I did not just list this property on the open market and wait for a young, naive couple to fall in love with the skyline view. I reached out to my professional network and contacted the commercial acquisitions team at Apex Holdings. At the mention of that specific name, Mr. Peterson, the HOA president, visibly stiffened. He knew exactly who they were. Apex Holdings was not a friendly family-run real estate agency. They were a multi-billion-dollar corporate landlord based out of New York, notorious across the country for aggressively acquiring premium luxury properties, gutting them down to the bare concrete, and converting them into high-density, ultra-premium rental units. They were absolutely ruthless in their business practices. They did not care about sob stories. They did not care about pregnant women needing a nursery. And they certainly did not care about fake tenant rights. Apex Holdings offered me $1.1 million in an all-cash transaction. I continued, my voice carrying the crisp, authoritative tone of a corporate boardroom presentation. They wanted the property immediately, and I was highly motivated to sell. Because I am a certified financial professional, I bypassed the traditional real estate agents and handled the heavy negotiations myself. We expedited the entire process. The standard property inspection was waived. The financial contingencies were completely dropped. The final documents were signed via a secure electronic closing system exactly 48 hours ago, while I was sitting in a quiet cafe near the River Thames. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the final page of the contract, right on the official notary stamp. The deed was legally transferred and recorded with the city 2 days before you even managed to change that pathetic lock on my front door. This penthouse belongs entirely to a corporate conglomerate now. Cassidy let out a sound that was half gasp and half scream. $1.1 million, she repeated, the sheer amount of money momentarily cutting through her rising panic. Her eyes darted toward DeAndre, her ingrained greed temporarily overriding her fear. "Where is the money, Natalie? You owe us half of that for the emotional distress you are putting us through. You cannot just take $1 million and leave your pregnant sister with absolutely nothing." I actually laughed out loud at her spectacular audacity. "The money," I smiled warmly at her, "is already gone." The exact second the massive wire transfer cleared the escrow account yesterday morning, I immediately routed the entire $1.1 million into an offshore, completely untouchable, high-yield trust fund established solely under my name. You could hire the absolute best forensic accountants in the entire state of Illinois, and they would not be able to access a single dime of it. You cannot sue me for it. You cannot guilt me into sharing it. It is entirely locked away, safe from the financial black hole that is this family. My mother let out a loud, dramatic wail, burying her face in her hands as if someone had just died. Richard slammed his heavy fist onto the marble counter, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. "You vindictive, heartless girl!" he roared, completely losing his carefully crafted composure. "How could you do this to your own flesh and blood? You sold your home out from under us just to prove a point." DeAndre, however, was not giving up his fantasy just yet. He stepped forward, his fists clenched tightly at his sides, his chest heaving as he desperately tried to project an authority he no longer possessed. He looked at the official escrow documents, then glared at me with desperate, frantic eyes. "It does not matter," DeAndre stammered loudly, his voice cracking slightly under the immense pressure. "It does not matter who you sold it to, Natalie. We still have our legal tenant rights. Even a massive corporation has to follow the strict laws of the city. They cannot just kick us out into the cold street tonight. They have to evict us legally through the courts." I stared at DeAndre, letting his frantic words hang in the air. Then I finally laughed out loud. It was not a polite chuckle or a sarcastic scoff. It was a genuine, full-throated laugh that echoed off the high ceilings of the kitchen. The sound was cold and completely devoid of familial warmth. The remaining guests shifted uncomfortably, recognizing someone who had absolutely checkmated her opponents. DeAndre's face flushed with anger and humiliation. "What is so funny?" he demanded, his voice cracking again. "You think the law is a joke. We have rights." I stopped laughing and looked at him with pure clinical precision. "You do not have rights, DeAndre. You have a fundamental misunderstanding of Chicago property law." I explained, my voice sharp and rapid. "To be considered a legal tenant in Illinois, you must meet specific criteria. You need a signed lease agreement, which you do not have. You need to have exchanged rent or monetary compensation with the property owner, which you never did. Or you need to establish squatter rights by occupying the premises continuously for a minimum of 30 days. I took a step closer to him, my eyes locked onto his sweating forehead. "How long have you been sleeping on my floor, DeAndre?" 3 whole days. 4. You changed a lock and forwarded some junk mail. That does not make you a tenant. That makes you a burglar with a new mailing address. My father stepped in, trying to salvage the situation. "It is a family dispute, Natalie. The police will not touch it. They will say it is a civil matter between relatives and tell you to take it to a judge. That is how the system works." I shook my head slowly, marveling at their arrogant ignorance. "That is exactly how the system works when family members argue over a property," I agreed calmly. "If I still owned this penthouse, you would be absolutely right. The police would show up, see you all standing here claiming I invited you, and they would refuse to physically remove you. They would force me to file a civil eviction notice to avoid any liability." "You calculated that perfectly, Richard." "You really did." I pointed to the heavy escrow folder resting on the marble island. "But you missed the most critical variable in your little equation. I do not own this property anymore. I transferred the title and the deed 48 hours ago. That means you did not establish your fake residency under my ownership. You established it under the ownership of Apex Holdings." Cassidy was trembling now, her hands gripping the edge of the counter to keep herself upright. "What difference does that make?" she cried out. "It makes all the difference in the world, Cassidy." I snapped back, my patience completely gone. "You are not my annoying family members overstaying a welcome. To Apex Holdings, you are legally classified as holdover trespassers on private corporate property. There is no civil family dispute for the police to avoid. You are unauthorized individuals occupying a multi-million-dollar asset owned by a ruthless commercial entity. And unlike me, Apex Holdings does not have to worry about looking like the bad guy at Thanksgiving dinner. They do not file civil eviction notices for people who have been here for 3 days. They file criminal trespassing charges." My mother let out a strangled sob, finally realizing the inescapable trap they had willingly walked into. They had bet everything on exploiting my familial guilt and my reluctance to drag my own blood relatives into a messy public court battle. They never anticipated that I would simply remove myself from the equation entirely and hand them over to a corporate machine that had no emotions, no guilt, and an army of lawyers. The air in the room grew completely stale. The bass from the unplugged speakers was long gone, replaced only by the sound of Cassidy's panicked breathing and DeAndre's rapid heartbeat. Even the party guests were silent, paralyzed by the sheer brutality of the legal trap that had just snapped shut. Then a distinct sound broke the heavy silence. It was the soft, melodic ping of the main elevators arriving in the private hallway right outside the front door. Not the service elevator they had used to sneak in, but the main secure elevator reserved for the penthouse level. Heavy synchronized footsteps stepped off the elevator car, marching deliberately across the carpeted hallway. Through the open front door, past the bewildered HOA president, the new arrivals stepped into the light. Four broad-shouldered men wearing dark tactical gear and heavy utility belts walked in first. Behind them, moving with the quiet, terrifying grace of a predator, was a tall man wearing a sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit. The man in the charcoal suit did not pause in the entryway. He walked straight past Mr. Peterson and the building security team, his leather shoes making sharp, authoritative sounds against the hardwood floor. The four men in tactical gear followed closely behind him, immediately fanning out to secure the perimeter of the living room. Their presence instantly drained whatever remaining bravado DeAndre had. The party guests pressed themselves against the walls, desperately trying to shrink out of sight. The man stopped a few feet from the kitchen island. He did not look at my parents. He did not look at Cassidy. He focused entirely on DeAndre, identifying him as the loudest obstacle in the room. "Good evening," he said, his voice smooth, completely professional, and entirely devoid of empathy. "My name is Mr. Montgomery. I am the senior corporate attorney representing Apex Holdings." DeAndre swallowed hard, taking a small, involuntary step backward. "You cannot be here," DeAndre managed to say, though his voice was barely a whisper. "We are tenants. We have rights." Mr. Montgomery did not argue. He simply reached inside his tailored jacket and retrieved a single piece of crisp white paper. He extended his arm, holding the paper out to DeAndre. When DeAndre refused to take it, Mr. Montgomery simply let it drop. The paper fluttered down, landing perfectly on the marble counter right next to the forged quitclaim deed. It was a stark visual representation of their failure. The fake legal document they had created was completely neutralized by the genuine corporate power resting beside it. "That is a formal notice of immediate removal," Mr. Montgomery explained calmly. "You are currently occupying a commercial asset owned by a multi-billion-dollar real estate conglomerate. My client took full legal possession of this property 2 days ago. We do not have a lease agreement with you. We do not recognize your forwarded mail. We do not recognize your changed locks. As far as my client is concerned, you broke into an empty, high-value corporate asset." Richard suddenly surged forward, his face red with a mix of fury and panic. "Now listen here, Montgomery," my father barked, trying to summon his usual patriarchal authority. "This is a massive misunderstanding. This is a family matter. My daughter Natalie owns this apartment, and she is just throwing a temper tantrum. We are not criminals. You need to call your bosses and tell them to back off until we sort this out internally." Mr. Montgomery finally turned his gaze toward my father. His expression remained entirely blank. "Sir, I do not care about your family matters," he replied, his tone chillingly polite. "I do not care about your internal disputes. I represent a corporate entity that aggressively protects its investments. If you were arguing with your daughter over her personal property, the police would likely advise you to settle it in civil court. However, you are no longer dealing with a relative. You are dealing with Apex Holdings." He gestured to the four men in tactical gear standing like statues around the room. These men are not regular police officers responding to a noise complaint. They are private corporate security contractors fully authorized and accompanied by off-duty law enforcement to secure our assets. Corporate property invasion is not handled through a slow civil eviction process. It is handled as a criminal offense. Cassidy let out another loud wail, clinging to DeAndre's arm. But I am pregnant! She cried out, tears streaming down her face, hoping her usual manipulation tactics would work on this stranger. You cannot put a pregnant woman out on the street. It is winter. We have nowhere else to go. Natalie, please tell them to stop. I stood quietly by the refrigerator, sipping my water, completely ignoring her pleas. Mr. Montgomery looked at Cassidy with the same cold indifference he had given my father. Madame, your medical condition is not the concern of Apex Holdings, he stated flatly. The law is very clear. Unauthorized entry and occupation of corporate property carries severe penalties. If you refuse to leave, you will not be served with eviction papers. You will be arrested for felony trespassing, breaking and entering, and criminal destruction of private property. DeAndre looked wildly around the room, realizing that his internet research had completely failed him. He had prepared for a drawn-out fight with a reluctant sister, not a blitzkrieg from a corporate legal team. He looked at his friends, but they were already inching toward the front door, abandoning him to save themselves from arrest. The reality of a felony conviction, the loss of his remaining credit, and the public humiliation finally crushed his arrogant facade. He was completely trapped. Mr. Montgomery did not wait for DeAndre to find his courage. He calmly reached into his pocket, pulled out a silver pocket watch, and checked the time. The gesture was incredibly deliberate and terrifying. He snapped the watch closed and looked up, locking eyes with DeAndre, then my father, and finally my mother. You have exactly 15 minutes to vacate my client's private property before these officers place you all in handcuffs. The moment the word handcuffs left Mr. Montgomery's mouth, the remaining illusion of a celebratory housewarming party violently shattered. Total, unadulterated chaos erupted in my living room. DeAndre's friends, the same men who had been happily drinking my stolen champagne and laughing at my expense just 10 minutes earlier, did not hesitate for a single second. They had no loyalty to a man who leased his lifestyle, and they certainly had no intention of catching a felony trespassing charge for him. One of the guys wearing a designer track jacket muttered a quick curse under his breath, dropped his plastic cup onto my hardwood floor, and bolted straight for the front door. The rest of the crowd immediately followed his lead like rats fleeing a sinking ship. They shoved past DeAndre, knocking his shoulder in their desperate rush to escape the corporate security team. "Wait, hold on, man!" DeAndre shouted, reaching out to grab the sleeve of his closest friend. "Do not leave. We can fight this. We have strength in numbers." His friend violently yanked his arm away, glaring at DeAndre with pure disgust. "I am not going to jail for your broke delusions," he spat before disappearing down the hallway. Within 60 seconds, the apartment was completely cleared of guests, leaving only my family surrounded by men in tactical gear. The mass exodus finally broke Cassidy. Her carefully constructed facade of the glowing, triumphant, expecting mother entirely collapsed. She began to hyperventilate, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps that echoed terribly in the suddenly empty room. She frantically gripped her stomach, her eyes darting wildly between the stone-faced security officers and the open doorway where all their guests had just fled. "Dad, do something!" Cassidy shrieked, her voice reaching a pitch that made the HOA president wince. "Dad, you promised me this was handled. You promised me we were legally protected. You said she could not touch us. Tell them to leave right now." She stomped her bare foot against the expensive wood floor, reverting to the spoiled toddler she had always been allowed to be. But the tantrums that had successfully manipulated our parents for 29 years held absolutely no power over the corporate attorney standing in my kitchen. Mr. Montgomery did not even blink at her screaming. He simply stood there, an immovable force, watching the digital numbers tick down on his pocket watch. 13 minutes, he announced, coldly, cutting right through Cassidy's hysterical sobbing. My father, unable to handle his golden child in distress and his own authority being challenged, decided to make one final disastrous play. Richard was a large man who had spent his entire life using his physical presence and booming voice to intimidate his wife, his daughters, and his subordinates at work. He genuinely believed that the sheer force of his patriarchal anger could bend reality to his will. He clenched his fists, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson, and charged directly at Mr. Montgomery. "Now you listen to me, you corporate suit!" Richard roared, raising his hand to point a thick, aggressive finger right in the attorney's face. No one comes into my family's home and threatens my pregnant daughter. You take your rent-a-cops and you get the hell out of here before I make a phone call and have your law license revoked. He took another step forward, attempting to use his chest to physically back the attorney down. It was the exact same bullying tactic he had used to terrorize me during my teenage years. But Mr. Montgomery did not retreat a single inch. Instead, two of the massive tactical officers immediately stepped forward, moving with frightening speed. They did not shout. They simply dropped their hands to rest heavily on the heavy-duty utility belts strapped to their waists right over their issued handcuffs and batons. They positioned themselves flawlessly between my father and the attorney. Richard froze instantly. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His bullying only worked on women and children who were financially dependent on him. In the real world, facing actual corporate authority and armed security, he was absolutely nothing. He slowly lowered his hand, shrinking back, his posture completely deflating as his entire worldview shattered. Seeing her husband neutralized and her son-in-law frozen, my mother understood the absolute finality of the situation. Brenda let out a guttural sob. She stumbled across the kitchen, her knees buckling beneath her. She fell to the floor before me, her hands desperately reaching out to grab the hem of my wool coat. I stared down at her, feeling no pity. "Natalie, please." Brenda wailed, tears streaming down her face, begging me to call off the sale. "We are your family. Where will Cassidy's baby sleep?" I looked down at the woman kneeling on my expensive hardwood floor. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy. I reached down, grabbed her wrists, and forcefully peeled her fingers off my wool coat. I stepped back, smoothing the fabric where her desperate hands had wrinkled it. "Do not use that word with me," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that made her flinch. "Do not ever call yourselves my family again. Family is supposed to protect you. Family is supposed to build you up. All you have ever done is view me as a walking ATM, a financial resource to be drained whenever Richard made a bad investment or Cassidy threw a tantrum. You want to talk about where people are going to sleep?" I continued, my anger finally breaking through the icy exterior I had maintained all evening. "Let us talk about where I slept when I was 18 years old. I worked double shifts at a diner all through high school, saving every single penny for my college tuition. I had $12,000 in a joint savings account. And on the morning my tuition was due, I went to the bank and found a balance of $0. You and Richard drained my entire account to pay off a massive gambling debt Richard had racked up, and you justified it by telling me I was smart enough to just get student loans. You let me start my adult life buried in crippling debt so you could protect your own selfish mistakes." My father looked away, unable to meet my eyes, the shame finally registering on his face now that his actions were being broadcast in front of armed security and a corporate attorney. But I was not finished. And then 4 years later, I graduated at the top of my class. I went to lease my very first apartment, only to be denied because my credit score was completely destroyed. Why was it destroyed, Mom? Because you secretly opened 2 credit cards using my social security number to buy Cassidy a new designer wardrobe for her sorority rush week. You maxed them out and let them go to collections. When I confronted you, you cried and manipulated me, saying family helps family, and that I was being cruel for wanting to press fraud charges against my own mother. I spent the next 3 years living in a terrible neighborhood, eating ramen noodles, meticulously repairing the financial damage you caused, while Cassidy lived in luxury on my stolen credit. Brenda was sobbing heavily into her hands now, the undeniable truth of her actions laid bare. "You conditioned me to accept your abuse under the guise of loyalty," I told them, my voice echoing in the dead quiet room. "You expected me to be your infinite safety net. Whenever DeAndre failed at another one of his fake crypto businesses, you called me for a bailout. Whenever Cassidy overspent her allowance, you demanded I cover the difference. You thought I would just keep taking it because I was the good, responsible older daughter who desperately wanted her parents to love her." I paused, letting the heavy silence stretch out for a moment. But that desperate girl died a long time ago. She died the moment I watched you on that security camera, casually hiring a man to break into my home so you could steal the biggest asset I had ever built for myself. You crossed the final boundary. You did not just ask for money this time. You tried to legally obliterate my ownership of my own life. So no, Brenda, we are not family. The ties are officially dead. I do not care where you sleep tonight. I do not care if DeAndre goes to jail. I do not care if Richard loses his house to pay for the legal fees you are about to drown in. You dug this massive hole with your own greed, and now you can all sit at the bottom of it. I turned my attention away from my weeping parents and locked eyes with my sister. Cassidy was leaning against the marble island, her face pale and streaked with running mascara. She was still instinctively cradling her stomach, desperately trying to maintain the performance that had been the cornerstone of their entire hostile takeover. I looked her up and down with absolute disgust. I took one final step toward her, dropping my voice so she could hear the absolute contempt in every word. By the way, I saw the overflowing trash can in the pantry when I walked in through the service entrance. I saw the 3 empty bottles of Pinot Noir sitting right on top. Stop using a fake pregnancy to steal property. It is pathetic. Cassidy's face turned a chalky, sickly white. Her hands immediately dropped from her supposedly pregnant stomach, hanging limply at her sides. The absolute shock of being entirely exposed paralyzed her. She opened her mouth to deny the empty wine bottles to spin another elaborate web of lies, but she could not find a single word. She looked desperately toward DeAndre for support, but her husband was no longer paying any attention to her theatrical performance. He was staring with wide, terrified eyes at the 4 heavily armed corporate security contractors standing perfectly still in my kitchen. 10 minutes, Mr. Montgomery announced, his voice slicing through the heavy, stale air of the apartment like a freshly sharpened blade. I highly suggest you begin gathering your personal effects immediately. That single sentence shattered the remaining paralysis in the room. Panic, raw and unfiltered, finally took complete control of DeAndre. The arrogant, posturing alpha male who had proudly popped my vintage champagne just half an hour ago completely vanished. He practically sprinted toward the kitchen pantry, his expensive-looking but cheaply made sneakers squeaking loudly against the hardwood floor. He threw open the cabinet doors beneath the sink, desperately tearing through the shelves, until he found a roll of heavy-duty black industrial garbage bags. He ripped 2 bags from the roll, his hands visibly shaking, and tossed one forcefully at Cassidy. Get up and start packing, he snapped at her, his voice frantic and high-pitched. Hurry up. Cassidy abandoned the fragile pregnant woman act entirely. She dropped to her hands and knees on the floor, her tight sequined dress riding up uncomfortably as she scrambled to gather the cheap, tacky decorations she had scattered around my living room. She violently shoved her fake neon green plants and peeling pink LED light strips into the black plastic bag. Tears of genuine terror and profound humiliation streamed down her face, mixing with her heavy makeup and dripping dark gray streaks onto the floorboards. She was moving so fast that she was hyperventilating, completely stripped of the unearned arrogance she had paraded around all evening. The contrast was absolutely staggering and immensely satisfying to watch. DeAndre, who had confidently lectured me on Chicago tenant laws while trying to intimidate a building manager, was now sweating profusely. Large, dark patches of sweat stained the underarms of his counterfeit designer shirt. He rushed into the master bedroom, entirely ignoring my parents, and began indiscriminately throwing his belongings into the trash bag. He tossed in his imitation gold chains, his knockoff designer belts, and handfuls of wrinkled clothes. Every time he moved too quickly, the tactical officer stationed near the bedroom door would adjust his stance, his heavy leather boots creaking, his hand resting casually near his handcuffs. Every single time that leather creaked, DeAndre would flinch violently, his shoulders hunching up in pure terror. He was a terrified scavenger, desperately trying to flee a sinking ship. Even my parents were forced into the humiliating labor. Richard, the man who demanded absolute respect and submission from everyone around him, was reduced to frantically stuffing Cassidy's cheap throw pillows into a plastic sack. His face was bright red with exertion and profound shame. He could not bring himself to look at the security guards at Mr. Montgomery, or at me. Brenda was weeping openly as she gathered Cassidy's shoes, mourning not just the loss of the apartment, but the complete and total annihilation of their social status and familial control. The beautiful minimalist architecture of my luxury penthouse provided a stark, punishing backdrop to their pathetic scramble. The only sounds left in the entire apartment were the frantic rustling of thick plastic garbage bags, the heavy, panicked breathing of my family members, and the rhythmic, unforgiving ticking of Mr. Montgomery checking his silver pocket watch. I stood calmly by the kitchen island, leaning my weight against the cool marble, and took another slow sip of my ice water. I watched their frantic, degrading movements with cold, calculating detachment. They were literally bagging up their own garbage under armed supervision. 5 minutes, Mr. Montgomery stated flatly. DeAndre zipped his fake leather duffel bag shut with a harsh tug. He was sweating so much it dripped from his chin. He looked around the kitchen with wild, desperate eyes, his bruised ego clearly needing to salvage anything of value from this catastrophic defeat. His gaze landed on my kitchen counter, specifically on the gleaming chrome of my imported Italian espresso machine. It was a custom piece I had ordered directly from Milan, worth over $5,000. DeAndre lunged forward, wrapping both of his large hands around the heavy metal base of the machine, intending to rip the cord from the wall and take it with him to pawn. I stepped forward immediately, slamming my glass of water down onto the counter. I locked eyes with him, my voice ringing out like a gunshot in the quiet room. That conveys with the property, DeAndre. Touch it, and it is grand larceny. DeAndre snatched his hands away from the espresso machine as if the polished metal had burned him. He stumbled backward, his eyes darting toward the tactical officer who had taken a deliberate step in his direction. The threat was abundantly clear. DeAndre swallowed hard, turned around, and went back to violently shoving his cheap clothes into the duffel bag. 5 minutes, Mr. Montgomery announced, his pocket watch snapping shut with a sharp metallic click. Officers, please begin escorting the unauthorized individuals to the service elevator. They are not permitted to linger. The 4 security contractors moved in perfect synchronization. They formed a tight, intimidating perimeter around my family, effectively herding them toward the front door. Richard, the man who had built his entire identity on projecting wealth and demanding respect from everyone around him, was forced to hoist a heavy black garbage bag over his shoulder. The plastic stretched and tore slightly under the weight of Cassidy's discarded decorations. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated humiliation. He kept his eyes glued to his expensive leather shoes, entirely unable to look at me as he shuffled past the kitchen island. My mother followed behind him, dragging a second trash bag across the floor. Brenda had spent her whole life curating the perfect image of a wealthy, successful suburban matriarch. She thrived on the envy of her friends and the perceived superiority of our family. Now her designer cardigan was wrinkled, her makeup was smeared from crying, and she was being physically driven out of a luxury building like a common criminal. They stepped out of Unit 42 and into the softly lit, carpeted hallway of the penthouse level. But their nightmare was not over. The loud confrontation in my apartment had not gone unnoticed. In a building where residents paid a premium for absolute privacy and quiet, a tactical eviction was the ultimate spectacle. Several heavy mahogany doors up and down the corridor were now wide open. My wealthy, established neighbors were standing in their doorways, arms crossed, watching the entire humiliating procession unfold. As my mother dragged her garbage bag down the hall, she suddenly froze. Standing right outside Unit 44 was Mrs. Gable, a prominent socialite and board member of a major local charity. Just 6 hours earlier, Brenda had cornered Mrs. Gable in the lobby elevator. I knew this because the building concierge had texted me about my mother loudly bragging to anyone who would listen that she had just purchased the penthouse outright to provide a luxury nursery for her pregnant daughter. Brenda looked up and locked eyes with Mrs. Gable. The older woman was wearing a silk robe, holding a glass of white wine, and staring at my mother with an expression of profound disgust and pity. Mrs. Gable did not speak. She simply took a sip of her wine, shook her head slightly, and gently closed her door right in my mother's face. The soft click of the lock echoing in the hallway was the sound of my mother's absolute social annihilation. Brenda let out a choked, humiliated sob, and tried to hide her face behind her free hand, walking faster toward the service elevator. Cassidy and DeAndre were the last to leave my apartment. Cassidy was carrying a cardboard box full of toiletries, her face red and swollen from crying. DeAndre was struggling with his overstuffed duffel bag, sweating profusely under the harsh glare of the hallway lighting. As they reached the bank of service elevators, one of the security officers reached out and pressed the call button. The waiting period was excruciating. The heavy silence in the corridor finally broke the last remaining thread of Cassidy's sanity. She could no longer play the supportive wife. The reality of having nowhere to sleep, no luxury condo, and a mountain of legal trouble completely shattered her facade. She turned slowly to look at her husband. "This is entirely your fault," Cassidy hissed, her voice echoing off the marble walls of the elevator lobby. DeAndre looked at her stunned. "Excuse me," he shot back, his own panic morphing into defensive anger. "You are the one who told me this plan was foolproof. You said your sister would just roll over and take it." Cassidy dropped her cardboard box, scattering plastic bottles across the floor. "I would not even be in this position if you were a real man who could actually provide for his family," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger right at his chest. "If you were not completely broke and drowning in debt, we would not have had to steal an apartment. You are a massive failure, DeAndre." Their marriage built entirely on shallow flexing, and stolen money began to fracture in real time right outside my door. The ride down the service elevator was agonizingly slow. The heavy metal doors closed tightly, sealing my family inside a cold, sterile, brightly lit stainless steel box alongside the 4 silent corporate security officers. There was no music in this elevator. There was only the low mechanical hum of the cables and the ragged sound of Cassidy crying into DeAndre's shoulder. Richard and Brenda stood stiffly in the corner, clutching their torn plastic garbage bags, their eyes fixed firmly on the digital floor indicator, slowly counting down to the ground level. Every passing second in that confined space stripped away another layer of their completely fabricated dignity. When the elevator finally jolted to a halt at the ground floor, the doors slid open to reveal the building's rear service exit, a stark contrast to the luxurious marble lobby they had strutted through just 3 days earlier. "Move along." One of the security contractors instructed, his voice echoing in the concrete loading dock. He gestured toward the heavy steel fire doors leading out to the alleyway. "You are officially off the premises. Do not attempt to re-enter the building." My father pushed open the heavy metal door, and the harsh reality of a Chicago November hit them instantly. It was raining. It was not a gentle misty drizzle, but a freezing, relentless, blinding downpour, driven by sharp gusts of wind blowing right off Lake Michigan. The icy water immediately soaked through Brenda's expensive cashmere cardigan and plastered Cassidy's thin sequined party dress right to her shivering body. They stepped out onto the wet, unforgiving concrete sidewalk, the heavy steel door slamming completely shut and locking automatically behind them. They were entirely locked out in the cold. Richard dropped his heavy garbage bag onto the pavement. The cheap plastic snagged on a rough patch of concrete and tore open, spilling a cluster of fake neon green vines into a dirty puddle. He ignored it, turning up the collar of his jacket against the biting wind. "Go pull the car around, DeAndre." Richard barked, his voice trembling slightly from the sudden freezing temperature. "Hurry up, we cannot stand out here in this weather. Cassidy is going to freeze." DeAndre did not move. He stood on the sidewalk, rain dripping from his fake gold chains down the collar of his counterfeit designer shirt. He stared blankly at the wet pavement. "Did you not hear me?" my father yelled over the sound of the pouring rain and passing traffic. "Go get the BMW from the parking garage right now. I do not have the car." DeAndre finally admitted, his voice barely audible over the wind. The humiliation in his tone was absolute. "The repo company took it from my office parking lot last Wednesday. I told you I do not have a vehicle right now. We took an Uber to get here tonight." Richard stared at his son-in-law, his mouth opening in pure disbelief. Brenda let out another loud, desperate sob, pulling her soaked sweater tighter around her trembling shoulders. The complete depth of their catastrophic failure was finally settling in. They had attempted to steal $1 million penthouse, and now they were standing in an alleyway next to a dumpster getting soaked to the bone without even a car to shelter in. Call another Uber. Then Cassidy shrieked, her teeth chattering violently as the freezing rain ruined her professional blowout and washed her expensive makeup down her face. Call an extra-large vehicle. We have all these heavy bags. Just get us out of here right now. DeAndre frantically pulled his phone out of his pocket, desperately trying to shield the sensitive screen from the pouring rain with his bare hand. His fingers were shaking so badly from the cold and the adrenaline crash that he kept mistyping his security passcode. When he finally opened the rideshare application, the screen glowed brightly in the dark alley. Because of the sudden storm and the late hour, the surge pricing was astronomical. And because his credit cards were completely maxed out, the application instantly declined his primary payment method, flashing a bright red error message. He stood there tapping the wet screen over and over again, in sheer panic, completely unable to secure a ride home. They were entirely stranded. They huddled together against the cold brick wall of the building, 4 miserable people surrounded by torn garbage bags full of useless, cheap decorations. The social destruction was complete, but the physical misery was really just beginning. Suddenly, the bright headlights of a sleek black executive town car cut through the dark, rainy street. The expensive vehicle pulled up smoothly to the curb, stopping right in front of the main lobby entrance just a few short yards away from the dark alley. The glass doors of the lobby slid open. I walked out onto the covered entranceway. I was perfectly dry, my warm wool coat buttoned up, pulling my single designer suitcase effortlessly behind me. A uniformed driver immediately stepped out of the town car, opened the rear passenger door, and held a large black umbrella over my head to protect me from the wind. I did not look back. I did not cast a single glance toward the dark alley where my former family was shivering in the freezing rain. I simply stepped into the warm, leather-scented interior of the car, closed the heavy door, and left them entirely behind, in the cold, unforgiving storm, to face the consequences alone. The heavy door of the town car sealed shut with a solid, satisfying thud, instantly cutting off the howling wind and the freezing rain. Inside the vehicle, the air was deeply warm, carrying the faint, rich scent of expensive leather and polished wood. Soft jazz played quietly through the high-end speakers, creating a sanctuary of absolute calm. I settled back into the plush seat, letting out a long, slow breath. The physical exhaustion of my transatlantic flight and the intense adrenaline of the confrontation finally began to recede, leaving behind a profound sense of clarity. Outside the tinted window, the reality of my departure finally broke through my father's state of shock. Through the dark glass, I saw Richard suddenly snap out of his paralyzed stance. He dropped his torn plastic garbage bag right onto the flooded pavement, completely ignoring the fake plants spilling into the dirty puddle. His face contorted into a mask of absolute desperate rage. He began sprinting across the slick concrete toward my idling car. He moved with a frantic, uncoordinated, heavy urgency, the freezing rain violently whipping against his face and soaking his expensive jacket. My uniformed driver glanced into the rearview mirror, his brow furrowing with professional concern as he watched the large, angry man charging directly at us. "Ma'am," the driver asked calmly, keeping his hand steady on the steering wheel. "Shall I pull away now?" "No," I replied, my voice perfectly level. "Wait just one moment." Richard reached the side of the town car. He slammed his wet, heavy fists against the reinforced tinted glass right next to my face. The sound was a dull, desperate thud over the quiet jazz playing inside. He was shouting something, his mouth moving rapidly, but the soundproofing of the luxury vehicle completely muffled his words. He looked absolutely pathetic, a supposed patriarch reduced to pounding on a window in a dark alleyway like a feral animal. I reached out and pressed the silver button on the door panel. The window glided down smoothly, stopping halfway. The brutal, freezing cold air of the Chicago storm immediately rushed into the warm cabin, carrying the scent of wet asphalt and garbage. "You think you have won," Richard roared, his voice cracking violently over the sound of the pouring rain. He gripped the edge of the slightly open window with his thick, shaking fingers, his knuckles turning white. "You are a monster, Natalie. You are a cold, Calculating monster. You just ruined your pregnant sister's life for absolutely no reason other than your own selfish pride. You are going to pay for this. I swear to you, I will make sure everyone in our family knows exactly what you did tonight. He leaned in closer, his face dripping with freezing rain, trying to use the ultimate weapon of a toxic parent. He tried to weaponize abandonment. You are dead to us. He spat his eyes wide and unhinged. Do you hear me? You are completely dead to this family. Do not ever call us. Do not ever show your face at our door. You are going to die completely alone in whatever expensive fortress you build for yourself, because nobody will ever truly love a selfish snake like you. He expected me to flinch. He expected the little girl who had spent her entire life desperately chasing his approval to finally crack under the threat of permanent excommunication. But that little girl was gone. I looked at him feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no regret. I was simply looking at a stranger standing in the rain. I died to you, the day you decided my only value was what you could take from me, I said, my voice steady, carrying over the wind without needing to shout. Have a nice life, Richard. I did not wait for his response. I pressed the silver button again. The window glided up seamlessly, forcing him to quickly snatch his fingers away before the glass sealed shut. Drive, please, I instructed the chauffeur. The powerful engine purred, and the town car pulled smoothly away from the curb. I looked in the side mirror one last time. Richard was standing completely alone in the pouring rain, his arms hanging limply at his sides, watching my taillights disappear into the dark city streets. Behind him, my mother, my sister, and my brother-in-law were nothing more than miserable, shivering shapes huddled next to a pile of wet garbage bags. As the car merged onto the busy downtown avenue, I opened my designer handbag. I did not pull out a tissue to cry. I reached into a small zippered compartment and pulled out a sleek, brand-new smartphone, still in its original plastic wrapping. I had purchased it at the airport in London, anticipating this exact moment. I powered the device on the screen, illuminating with a completely new phone number that no one in my former family possessed. Then I took my old phone, popped the tiny tray open with an earring, and removed my original SIM card. The car came to a gentle stop at a red traffic light. I cracked my window open just 1 inch, raised my hand and flicked the tiny piece of plastic out into the storm. It bounced once on the wet pavement and fell straight through the grate of a storm drain, disappearing forever. 48 hours later, the adrenaline of that stormy Chicago night had evaporated, leaving behind the harsh light of consequence. While I was finalizing the purchase of a new property in a different time zone, the absolute destruction of my family was unfolding exactly as I calculated. They had spent the weekend crammed into my parents' outdated 3-bedroom house in the suburbs. It was a house my mother had been trying to sell for years because she felt it was beneath her social standing. Now, with 4 angry adults and a pile of trash bags stuffed into the living room, it felt like a prison. For DeAndre, the nightmare was escalating from personal humiliation to a professional catastrophe. On Monday morning, he put on his only clean dress shirt, desperately trying to project success, as he walked into the mid-level brokerage firm where he worked as a junior financial consultant. It was the job he used to fund his crypto gambling. He walked past the cubicles expecting morning greetings. Instead, he was met with dead silence. People actively looked away, pretending to be engrossed in their computer monitors. He did not have time to sit down before his desk phone rang. It was the managing director, a strict finance manager who despised bad publicity. He ordered DeAndre into his office immediately. When DeAndre stepped through the glass doors, he saw the manager sitting behind his heavy oak desk, his laptop turned around to face the guest chairs. Playing on a continuous loop on the bright screen was a TikTok video. It was a video of my living room. One of DeAndre's so-called friends, the guys who had fled to avoid arrest, had kept his phone recording the entire time. The video captured everything in brutal high-definition clarity. It showed Mr. Montgomery handing over the eviction notice. It showed the armed tactical officers, It showed me publicly exposing DeAndre's maxed out credit cards and his repossessed BMW. The friend had uploaded it on Saturday morning with a mocking caption about fake crypto bros getting evicted. By Monday, the algorithm had picked it up. It had been shared thousands of times across their social circle local networking groups, and even among the firm's client base. The managing director did not yell. He simply paused the video on a frame, showing DeAndre sweating in front of the armed guards. "Our firm manages wealth," DeAndre, the director, said coldly. "Our clients trust us to make sound, ethical financial decisions. What I am looking at is a public display of fraud, grand larceny, and catastrophic personal judgment. You attempted to illegally squat in a luxury property. You lied about your assets." DeAndre stammered, his face burning hot. He tried to explain that it was a family dispute and the video lacked context. The managing director held up a hand, silencing him instantly. "There is no context that excuses criminal trespassing," he stated firmly. "Human Resources has prepared your termination paperwork. Effective immediately, you are fired. We are legally obligated to report suspected fraudulent behavior, so do not expect a reference. Hand over your keycard and have security escort you out." Within 20 minutes, DeAndre was standing on the pavement outside his office, holding a small cardboard box. His career in finance was completely dead. When he returned to my parents' cramped suburban house that afternoon, the tension inside was thick. Cassidy was sitting on the worn-out sofa, complaining loudly to my mother about how uncomfortable the guest bed was. She did not ask DeAndre how his day went. She just looked at him and demanded to know when they were going to look for an apartment. Something inside DeAndre snapped. He dropped his cardboard box onto the floor, silencing Cassidy mid-sentence. He stared at the woman he had married, finally seeing her not as a golden child with wealthy parents, but as an entitled anchor dragging him underwater. "I got fired today, Cassidy," he said, his voice trembling with rage. "Because of that stupid plan you and your parents cooked up. Because you convinced me your sister was a pushover." Cassidy scoffed, crossing her arms defensively. "How is that my fault? You are the man of the house. You were supposed to protect us." DeAndre let out a bitter laugh. He turned his back on her, walked straight into the cramped guest bedroom, and grabbed the fake leather duffel bag he had hurriedly packed at my penthouse. He walked back into the living room, slinging the bag over his shoulder. "You and your family are a complete disease," he spat, ignoring my mother's gasp. "I am not going down with this ship. Have fun raising that baby in this dump." And with that, he walked out the front door, slamming it shut behind him. The heavy slam of the front door rattled the cheap picture frames on my parents' living room wall, leaving Cassidy completely alone with the mess she had helped create. While she sat on that sagging sofa, weeping over her shattered marriage and her ruined reputation, I was miles away, experiencing an entirely different kind of mourning. I was sitting comfortably in a plush leather armchair inside the private first-class departure lounge at the international airport. The atmosphere was a perfect sanctuary of quiet luxury. Soft instrumental music played from hidden speakers embedded in the ceiling. A uniformed attendant had just brought me a fresh cappuccino in a heavy porcelain cup, accompanied by a warm butter croissant on a silver plate. I took a slow sip of the perfectly frothed coffee, enjoying the absolute peace of a life completely detached from their endless drama. I was waiting for my direct flight to Texas, ready to start the next chapter of my life with a massive influx of cash and zero familial dead weight. I opened my tablet to review some final financial portfolios from my independent consulting firm. As I connected to the secure lounge network, a small notification icon popped up in the upper right corner of my screen. It was a direct message alert from LinkedIn. I frowned slightly, staring at the blue icon. I used LinkedIn strictly for high-level corporate networking and client acquisition. I had systematically blocked my parents Cassidy and DeAndre across every personal social media platform, phone carrier, and email provider the moment I stepped into my executive car on Saturday night. But I had completely forgotten about my professional networking profile because none of them had ever shown any interest in my career before today. I clicked the notification. It was a direct message from my sister. Her profile picture was still a highly edited, glamorous shot from her fake housewarming party. But the message attached to it was a desperate, chaotic wall of text. It was a massive 5-paragraph sob story, typed frantically with terrible grammar and absolute panic. I read through the paragraphs with the clinical detachment of an actuary analyzing a failed business model. The entire message was a masterclass in narcissistic deflection. In the first paragraph, Cassidy wailed about being abandoned. She detailed how DeAndre had cruelly packed his bags and walked out on his pregnant wife, leaving her stranded in our parents' cramped, miserable house. In the second paragraph, she completely rewrote history. She claimed that she never wanted to take my penthouse in the first place. She insisted that DeAndre was a manipulative, controlling monster who had forced her to go along with the squatter scheme to cover up his own massive financial failures. She painted herself as a helpless victim of a bad marriage, entirely ignoring the fact that I had watched her happily directing the movers and trying on my expensive jewelry on the security cameras. The third paragraph shifted the blame onto our parents. Cassidy threw Richard and Brenda completely under the bus. She wrote that Dad was a toxic bully who pressured her into signing the fake quitclaim deed, and that Mom had orchestrated the locksmith because she was obsessed with keeping up appearances for her country club friends. According to Cassidy, everyone else in the family was toxic except for her. The fourth paragraph was an offensive attempt at emotional manipulation. She brought up a twisted memory from when we were kids, a time I supposedly protected her from a neighborhood bully. She tried to invoke a bond of sisterhood that had never actually existed outside of her own delusions. She told me I was the strong one, the smart one, the only person she could truly rely on, now that her entire world had fallen apart. The final paragraph was the inevitable request. After hundreds of words of deflecting blame and playing the ultimate victim, she finally asked for what she really wanted. She begged me to book her a room at a luxury downtown hotel because she simply could not survive another night listening to our parents argue. She asked for a small loan of $10,000 to hire a divorce attorney. She promised she would pay me back eventually, begging me to just answer the message so we could talk like real sisters. I finished reading the message and set my tablet down on the small glass table next to my cappuccino. I did not feel a single twinge of guilt. I did not feel the old familiar urge to swoop in and rescue her from the consequences of her own terrible decisions. There was absolutely no accountability in her words. Not a single apology for breaking into my home. Not a single acknowledgement of the theft, the lies, or the public humiliation she had gleefully participated in. I picked up my smartphone. I opened a web browser and quickly navigated to the viral video platform. It took me less than 10 seconds to find the trending video of DeAndre getting humiliated by the corporate security team in my living room, with Cassidy sobbing hysterically in the background. I paused the video right at the exact moment where the corporate attorney handed over the trespassing notice. I took a high-resolution screenshot of that pathetic frozen moment in time. I transferred the image to my tablet. I opened the reply box on LinkedIn. I did not write a long emotional paragraph back. I did not offer any advice or closure. I simply attached the screenshot of the viral eviction video. Underneath the image, I typed exactly 4 words. Actions meet consequences. I hit send. Before she could even type a reply, I navigated to her profile settings and permanently blocked her account. I closed the application, picked up my fresh croissant, and took a bite. As I finished my breakfast and boarded my flight to Texas, the financial reality of my parents' failed scheme was finally crashing down on their heads. My mother and father had always projected an image of upper-middle-class wealth, but the truth was, their bank accounts were entirely hollow. To execute their hostile takeover of my penthouse, Richard and Brenda had spent a staggering $15,000. They paid an unethical bottom-feeding lawyer a premium retainer to draft that useless quitclaim deed. They paid an exorbitant emergency fee in cash to bribe the shady locksmith into drilling out my high-security smart lock without asking for proof of ownership. They even paid for the moving trucks and DeAndre's fake luxury staging furniture. It was supposed to be a foolproof investment. They genuinely thought they were spending $15,000 to secure $1 million property for their golden child. Instead, they had literally set their dwindling retirement savings on fire. And the financial bleeding did not stop there. With DeAndre gone, Cassidy was now permanently living in my parents' outdated suburban house. My sister was pregnant, newly single, and completely incapable of functioning as an independent adult. She had zero income and massive credit card debt from her fake, glamorous lifestyle. She demanded my mother cook specialized organic meals for her pregnancy, complaining loudly when Brenda brought home generic grocery brands to save money. She ran the air conditioning at all hours, skyrocketing their utility bills. She constantly complained about the lack of space, the ugly decor, and the fact that she no longer had a husband to fund her shopping habits. The stress of supporting a demanding 29-year-old dependent immediately fractured my parents' marriage. The house became a pressure cooker of resentment, shouting matches and past due notices. But Richard, fueled by his toxic pride and absolute refusal to accept defeat, decided to double down. Instead of cutting his losses and looking for a second job to cover his newly expanded household expenses, he decided to attack me legally. He found another desperate attorney willing to work on contingency and filed a massive civil lawsuit against both me and Apex Holdings. When the official summons arrived at my new business address in Texas, I actually had to laugh at the sheer audacity of the claims. Richard was suing me for severe emotional distress, financial damages, and breach of verbal contract. His official court filing argued that I had allegedly made a verbal promise years ago to provide housing for Cassidy, and that by selling the property to a corporation, I had maliciously endangered a pregnant woman. I did not even bother booking a flight back to Chicago for the hearing. I did not need to. The corporate legal team at Apex Holdings, led by the ruthless Mr. Montgomery, handled the entire situation. They were absolutely thrilled to defend their legal acquisition and crush a nuisance lawsuit. The court date arrived a month later. According to the transcript my attorney forwarded me, Richard showed up to the courthouse wearing his best tailored suit, acting like a wealthy patriarch, seeking justice against an ungrateful daughter and a greedy corporation. He brought Cassidy along to play the weeping, distressed pregnant victim in front of the judge. They had practiced their routine for weeks, fully expecting to drag me through months of expensive litigation until I settled out of court just to make them go away. They did not even make it past the preliminary review. The presiding judge, a no-nonsense magistrate with zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, called the case. She put on her reading glasses, opened the thick file, and reviewed Richard's complaint. Then she looked at the defense evidence provided by Mr. Montgomery. She looked at the legally binding escrow documents, the clear electronic closing timeline, the police report regarding the illegal lock change, and the criminal trespassing citations issued by the tactical security officers. The judge lowered her glasses and looked directly at my father. She did not ask for opening statements. She did not allow Cassidy to start her crying routine. "Let me understand this correctly," the judge said, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. "You broke into a secured luxury property, attempted to force the legal owner to sign over $1 million asset for $1, and when she lawfully sold the property instead, you decided to waste the time of this court by suing her for emotional distress." Richard opened his mouth to argue his ridiculous verbal contract theory, trying to manipulate the judge the way he manipulated his family. But the judge slammed her gavel down so hard the sound echoed sharply off the wood-paneled walls. She threw the entire case out in exactly 4 minutes. It was a complete, humiliating dismissal with prejudice, meaning Richard could never file the lawsuit again. But the judge was not finished. Recognizing the malicious intent behind the filing, she invoked a strict penalty against my father for bringing a frivolous lawsuit to her courtroom. She officially ordered Richard to pay the entirety of Apex Holdings' exorbitant legal defense fees. My father had walked into that courthouse hoping to extort me for a quick settlement. He walked out exactly 4 minutes later, saddled with an additional $42,000 in corporate attorney fees, sealing his absolute financial ruin. While Richard was drowning in a $42,000 legal judgment, my mother was facing a completely different kind of destruction. For Brenda, money was always just a tool to buy social status. Her entire identity, her self-worth, and her daily purpose were entirely wrapped up in how she was perceived by the wealthy suburbanites in their hometown. She had spent 2 decades meticulously curating the image of the perfect affluent matriarch with a flawless family. The absolute crown jewel of my mother's fabricated life was her position on the executive planning committee at the prestigious Oak Ridge Country Club. She lived for those Tuesday morning meetings. She loved sitting at the polished mahogany conference table, sipping sparkling water and passing harsh judgment on other families who did not meet her impossible standards. But the internet is an incredibly small and ruthless place. DeAndre's viral eviction video had not just circulated among junior financial workers. It had leaped across demographics. The teenage daughter of the country club president had seen the video on her social media feed. She immediately recognized the screeching woman in the soaked cashmere cardigan and the red-faced man holding a trash bag as Mr. and Mrs. Wilson from the clubhouse dining room. The teenager showed the video directly to her mother. Within 24 hours, the high-definition footage of my parents being escorted out of my penthouse by armed corporate security was the hottest topic of gossip in their elite circle. They were not seen as victims. They were seen as common thieves attempting to steal a luxury property. When Brenda walked into the country club the Tuesday after the court dismissal, she expected to seek comfort. She planned to sit down with her committee, cry delicate tears, and play the tragic victim of a cruel, ungrateful daughter. Instead, she was met with absolute freezing silence. The women she considered her closest friends physically turned their backs to her as she walked through the opulent lobby. The club president, a woman my mother had spent years sucking up to, intercepted Brenda before she could even reach the meeting room doors. The president did not smile. She did not invite my mother to sit down. She simply stood in the hallway and handed Brenda a sealed white envelope. She stated plainly that the committee had reviewed the highly public footage of Brenda and her family attempting to illegally squat in a commercial property. The president explained that the country club had a strict moral clause and they simply could not associate their upcoming charity gala with individuals involved in a viral grand larceny scandal. To make the humiliation complete, the president added that their family membership was officially suspended, pending a review of 3 months of unpaid membership dues. Brenda stumbled out of the country club and into the parking lot, her perfect facade completely and permanently annihilated. She was a social pariah. The women she had desperately tried to impress now viewed her as absolute trash. The psychological toll of losing her pristine status broke her mind. She could not accept that her own greed and entitlement had caused this isolation. In her twisted reality, I was the sole architect of her destruction. She needed to hurt me. She needed to see me suffer the exact same public professional humiliation she had just endured. Driven by pure, unadulterated spite, Brenda got into her car and drove straight toward downtown Chicago. She was heading for the towering glass skyscraper where my corporate auditing firm was headquartered. She marched into the building lobby with a manic, frantic energy, riding the express elevator up to the 40th floor. She planned to scream, to cry, and to publicly accuse me of elderly abuse right in the middle of my open plan office. She wanted my boss to hear it. She wanted my colleagues to stare at me with the same disgust her former friends had shown her just an hour ago. Brenda pushed through the heavy glass doors of the accounting firm and marched directly up to the sleek marble reception desk. She slammed her hands down hard on the polished surface, breathing heavily. She demanded that the receptionist call Natalie down immediately so everyone in the building could hear what a manipulative monster I truly was. She promised she would not leave the lobby until I was dragged out and fired. The receptionist, a young woman who had known me and worked with me for 5 years, did not flinch or reach for the phone. She looked at my mother with a mixture of deep pity and utter confusion. She shook her head slowly, pulling her hands away from the keyboard. "I am sorry, ma'am," the receptionist replied gently, her voice carrying across the quiet reception area. "You must be deeply misinformed. Natalie does not work here anymore. She resigned her position, sold all her local assets, and moved completely out of the state over 2 weeks ago." The receptionist in Chicago was absolutely and entirely correct. By the time my mother was screaming in that Chicago lobby, I was already 1,000 miles away, stepping out of the Austin Bergstrom International Airport and into my entirely new life. The contrast between my past and my present was immediate and physical. I had left behind a freezing gray, suffocating city where the bitter wind felt like a physical manifestation of my family's constant demands. In Austin, the sky was an endless, vibrant blue, and the warm Texas sun immediately thawed the residual tension I had been carrying in my shoulders for 34 years. I breathed in the fresh open air and felt a profound sense of absolute freedom. I was no longer the convenient scapegoat or the reliable ATM. I was just Natalie, a free woman with a clean slate and a completely secure offshore bank account. I did not waste a single day settling in. I had already arranged a meeting with one of the most exclusive luxury real estate brokers in the state. Her name was Maria, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who specialized in high-net-worth clients demanding absolute privacy. When we met at her downtown Austin office surrounded by sleek, modern architecture, she had a portfolio of premium penthouses ready for me to review. She thought I wanted another luxury high-rise experience. I gently pushed the glossy brochures back across her desk. I told her I was completely done with shared walls building managers and service elevators that could be easily breached. I wanted open space. I wanted significant distance from the city noise. I wanted an impenetrable fortress. Maria immediately understood the assignment. We got into her luxury SUV and drove out of the bustling city center, heading deep into the rolling scenic landscapes of the Texas Hill Country. After a 40-minute drive, we pulled up to a massive wrought iron gate set into a high stone wall. The gate slowly swung open, revealing a winding oak-lined driveway that led to a stunning modern ranch-style estate. It sat on 12 acres of pristine private land. There were no neighbors within shouting distance. There was no homeowners association to dictate the rules. The main house featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a private infinity pool and miles of untouched nature. It was breathtaking, expansive, and entirely secure. It was the exact opposite of the claustrophobic, easily invaded apartment I had lost to my family's greed. As I stood on the back patio listening to the quiet rustle of the wind through the oak trees, I knew immediately that I was finally home. The closing process was exceptionally swift. Because I was not relying on a bank for a mortgage, there were no agonizing weeks of underwriting or credit checks. Exactly 2 weeks after I first walked the property, I was sitting in a sunlit conference room at a premier title company, holding a heavy gold pen. The seller's agent sat across from me looking slightly amazed as I pulled a certified cashier's check from my leather portfolio. You rarely see all cash transactions of this magnitude close so effortlessly. The check was made out for the exact purchase price of $1.8 million, funded entirely by the profit from the Chicago sale and my own meticulously managed investment accounts. I slid the crisp piece of paper across the polished mahogany table, watching the agent verify the astronomical amount. It was the most satisfying financial transaction of my entire life. I was buying my absolute peace of mind in full, with zero debt and zero strings attached to anyone. But the most crucial part of the transaction was not the money itself. It was the name printed on the legal deed. When Richard and Brenda had tried to steal my condo, they had easily looked up my property tax records through the county website because my name was publicly listed as the owner. I was never going to make that mistake again. As I signed the final stack of closing documents, I was not signing as Natalie. I was signing as the sole trustee of a newly established ironclad legal entity called the Blue Bonnet Blind Trust. To the outside world, this massive, sprawling Texas estate was entirely owned by a faceless, anonymous corporation. My personal name would never once appear on a single public registry tax roll or utility bill associated with the property. Even if my parents somehow scrounged up the money to hire a private investigator, their search would hit an impenetrable brick wall of corporate privacy laws. They could scour the internet for the rest of their miserable lives, digging through every public database available, but they would never ever find my address. With my physical sanctuary secured behind iron gates and corporate blind trusts, I immediately turned my attention toward building my professional empire. Moving to Texas was not an early retirement. It was a strategic relocation. For the first 10 years of my career, I had poured my brilliance into making billions of dollars for a massive corporate auditing firm while quietly funneling my own hard-earned bonuses into my family's endless pit of debt. Without that parasitic drain on my energy and my bank accounts, my capacity for growth was absolutely explosive. I leased a beautiful sunlit commercial office space in downtown Austin, featuring exposed brick walls and panoramic views of the Colorado River. I officially registered my own independent financial consulting firm. I did not want to just manage money anymore. I wanted to build impenetrable financial fortresses for my clients, exactly like the one I had just built for myself. The demand for my specific brand of ruthless protective financial auditing was staggering. I deliberately targeted a highly specific clientele. I worked with high net worth women navigating brutal divorces, female entrepreneurs protecting their intellectual property from predatory partners, and individuals trying to untangle themselves from financially abusive family dynamics. Word of mouth spread like wildfire among the Texas elite. Within 6 months, my boutique firm was completely overwhelmed with high-paying clients. I was billing 3 times my previous corporate rate, and I was keeping every single dollar of it. The empowerment of true female financial independence is intoxicating. When you no longer have to ask for permission, and when you no longer fear the financial manipulation of toxic relatives, you become absolutely unstoppable. My portfolio skyrocketed, and I realized I could not handle the incredible volume of business entirely on my own. I needed to hire a team. But I did not just recruit aggressive finance graduates from Ivy League business schools. I built my firm with women who truly understood the high stakes of financial self-defense. I hired a brilliant tax strategist named Andrea, who had spent 5 years meticulously rebuilding her credit after a toxic ex-husband destroyed it. I brought on a senior auditor named Lauren, who had legally emancipated herself from a narcissistic mother at age 17 and paid her own way through night school. We were not just a group of accountants. We were a specialized task force of women who had all walked through the fire of financial abuse and come out the other side holding the matches. Our office culture was built on absolute transparency, fierce loyalty, and enforcing unbreakable boundaries. There was no family drama allowed. There was no toxic guilt. We celebrated every single victory with expensive lunches and massive quarterly bonuses that allowed my employees to buy their own homes and fund their own secure futures. I was finally surrounded by a chosen family that actively built me up instead of constantly tearing me down. Life settled into a beautiful, predictable rhythm of massive success and profound peace. About 14 months after that freezing night in Chicago, I was sitting at my custom walnut desk in my home office. The afternoon sun was casting a warm, golden glow across the rolling hills outside my floor-to-ceiling windows. I had just finished approving a massive profit-sharing distribution for my employees when a sharp chime echoed from my secure laptop. An email had just slipped past my aggressive spam filters. I frowned, clicking on my inbox. The sender address was completely unfamiliar. It was a generic, randomly generated string of numbers and letters from a free email hosting service. I opened the message cautiously, expecting a sophisticated corporate phishing scam. Instead, I saw a block of text that made the temperature in the room feel like it had dropped 10 degrees. The email began with 2 very simple words: "Please, Natalie." It was from my father. Richard had somehow managed to track down my public business email address, created a fake account to bypass my blocked contacts list, and slipped right past my professional gatekeepers. The message was a frantic, unstructured plea for help. He wrote that the $42,000 legal judgment from Apex Holdings had completely ruined them. The judge had placed a heavy lien on their house, and because of Cassidy and the new baby draining their remaining resources, they had missed 6 consecutive mortgage payments. The bank had officially initiated foreclosure proceedings. They had less than 30 days before the sheriff would arrive to physically lock them out onto the street. Richard abandoned every ounce of his patriarchal pride. He was begging his estranged, monstrous daughter for an immediate cash loan of $60,000 just to temporarily stop the bank from permanently taking their home. It was truly pathetic. I stared at the glowing screen, reading the frantic words of a man who had completely destroyed his own life through sheer arrogance. Years ago, an email like this would have sent me into an immediate panic attack. My heart would have pounded against my ribs, and the crushing weight of familial guilt would have forced me to reach for my checkbook. I would have drained my own savings to protect my parents from the consequences of their actions, believing that if I just saved them one more time, they might finally love me. But sitting in my beautiful Texas office, looking out at the rolling hills, my heart rate did not elevate a single beat. I did not feel panic. I did not feel guilt. Honestly, I did not even feel anger anymore. I felt nothing but the mild professional irritation of an auditor looking at a fundamentally flawed spreadsheet. I moved my mouse and clicked the reply button. A blank white text box opened on my screen. I placed my fingers on the keyboard and began to type. I did not write a furious, emotional response. I did not hurl insults or demand apologies for the way they had treated me. Instead, I channeled my entire career into the keyboard. I wrote a cold, highly calculated line-by-line financial analysis of their impending bankruptcy. I stripped away all the emotion and laid out the brutal, undeniable, mathematical reality of their situation. I started with the core asset. I typed out how if they had simply sold their outdated suburban house 2 years ago when the market was at its peak, they could have walked away with over $200,000 in pure equity. They could have taken that cash, purchased a comfortable, modest 2-bedroom townhome in a cheaper neighborhood outright, and lived completely debt-free. They could have easily offered Cassidy the spare bedroom without jeopardizing their own retirement. But my mother's obsession with maintaining a wealthy image for her country club friends made downsizing entirely unacceptable. Instead of making the logical financial choice, they chose to commit a felony. I moved on to the liabilities. I broke down the $42,000 legal judgment from Apex Holdings. I added the exorbitant lawyer fees they had paid to draft that forged quitclaim deed. I calculated the compound interest on their 6 missed mortgage payments, plus the severe late penalties the bank was absolutely applying to their account. Then I factored in the ongoing daily expense of fully supporting an unemployed, pregnant 29-year-old woman who refused to change her luxury spending habits. I laid the numbers out in perfectly formatted bullet points so Richard could not simply skim over the devastating reality of his financial failure. Finally, I addressed his desperate request for a $60,000 loan. I explained the concept of throwing good money after bad. I pointed out that even if an anonymous angel investor handed him $60,000 today in cash, it would not save his home. It would only cover the past due balance, the legal penalties, and perhaps 3 more months of basic living expenses. Because they had absolutely no structural plan to increase their monthly income or drastically reduce their spending, they would end up right back in foreclosure court before Cassidy even gave birth. The physical house was already lost. The math was completely undeniable. I finished typing and leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair. I read through the paragraphs carefully. It was a flawless, irrefutable deconstruction of their victim narrative. It was the ultimate told-you-so backed up by hard data and financial expertise. If I hit the send button, Richard would read it, and his fragile remaining patriarchal pride would be completely and utterly obliterated forever. I hovered my mouse cursor right over the blue send icon. I sat there for a long moment listening to the quiet hum of my air conditioning. Then a profound realization washed over me. Sending this email would require engaging with them. It would invite a response. It would give Richard an opening to argue, to beg, or to hurl more insults. It would keep the toxic umbilical cord attached for just one more day. I realized that the opposite of love is not hate or anger. Anger means you still care. Anger means they still hold power over your emotions. The true opposite of love is absolute indifference. I moved my mouse away from the send button. I highlighted the entire meticulously crafted financial analysis. I pressed the backspace key. The text vanished instantly, leaving a blank white box. I immediately clicked the delete draft option, permanently blocked the random new email address from my server, and then softly closed my laptop. That quiet click of my laptop closing marked the absolute end of my old life. The indifference I felt that afternoon became the solid foundation upon which I built everything else. I did not look back. I did not wonder if the sheriff had finally padlocked their door. I simply moved forward, pouring all my energy into the business and the amazing people that actually valued me. The months flew by in a blur of massive professional success and profound personal peace until November arrived once again. It was exactly 2 years since that freezing, catastrophic night in Chicago. The environment around me could not have been more different. I was hosting Thanksgiving dinner at my Texas estate. In the past holidays with my family were agonizing endurance tests. They were landmines of passive-aggressive comments, screaming matches over dry turkey, and my mother crying because someone did not appreciate her expensive centerpiece. I used to spend November dreading the inevitable holiday explosions. But this year, as the warm afternoon sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my massive kitchen, the only sounds filling the crisp air were genuine laughter and the soft clinking of our expensive crystal wine glasses. The people gathered around my custom 20-foot dining table were not bound to me by blood. They were my chosen family. They were the women who fought alongside me in the trenches of financial auditing, and the friends who understood the true value of boundaries. Andrea, my brilliant tax strategist, was standing at the kitchen island expertly carving the roasted turkey while telling a hilarious story about a nightmare corporate client, Lauren. My senior auditor was pouring generous glasses of a bold vintage Cabernet Sauvignon we had selected from my private wine cellar. Even Maria, the luxury real estate broker who had helped me secure this absolute fortress, had accepted my invitation and was happily chatting with my colleagues. There was absolutely no drama. There was no one demanding to be the center of attention. There was no golden child throwing a tantrum because her needs were not being prioritized above everyone else. If a dish was a little too salty, we laughed about it. When someone accidentally spilled wine on the linen tablecloth, no one screamed or assigned blame. We simply wiped it up and poured another glass. The atmosphere was completely saturated with mutual respect, deep gratitude, and an overwhelming sense of safety. These women did not look at me and see a bank account or a punching bag. They saw a mentor, a colleague, and a friend. We had all survived our own specific toxic family environments, and we had consciously chosen to build something so much better together today. After dinner, as the sun began to dip below the horizon and paint the Texas hill country in brilliant shades of orange and purple, my guests migrated out to the sweeping back patio. Someone started a fire in the massive stone fire pit, and the quiet murmur of peaceful conversation drifted back into the house. I stayed behind in the dining room for a moment, slowly clearing the dessert plates. I paused, taking in the beautiful aftermath of a perfect holiday. My tired heart finally felt incredibly light and entirely free from the heavy, suffocating guilt that had dictated my entire adult life before. I walked out of the dining room and stepped into the grand entryway of my home. The hardwood floors gleamed under the soft ambient lighting. I stopped and looked directly at the massive custom-built mahogany front door. Next to the heavy brass handle was a sleek, state-of-the-art biometric security panel. It was tied into a closed-circuit, highly encrypted surveillance system that monitored every single inch of my 12-acre property. It did not just require a passcode. It required my fingerprint, my retinal scan, and a randomized cryptographic token that changed every 30 seconds. There were no hidden emergency spare keys. There were no easily manipulated mechanical deadbolts. I reached out and gently ran my fingers over the cool, solid surface of the reinforced wood. I thought about the cheap brass lock my mother had installed on my penthouse door. I thought about the entitlement that drove them to invade my sanctuary. And then I looked at the glowing blue light of my new security scanner. I let a slow, deep smile spread across my face. I had completely fortified my world, both physically and emotionally. The toxic familial parasites of my past were permanently locked out, and the people who truly mattered were safe inside. I turned my back to the door and walked back toward the warmth of the fire, knowing with absolute unbreakable certainty that no one was ever breaking in again. As I walked back to the fire pit, leaving the heavy front door perfectly secured behind me, I took a moment to look up at the clear Texas night sky. The stars were brilliant, vast, and completely unobstructed by the towering skyscrapers I used to hide behind. Standing there listening to the warm, echoing laughter of the incredible women I now proudly called my true family, I realized that the absolute greatest investment I ever made was not the offshore high-yield trust fund or the sprawling modern estate. The greatest investment I made was finally recognizing my own inherent worth and refusing to let anyone diminish it ever again. It took walking through an absolute nightmare to finally wake up to my own strength and capability. For so many agonizing years, I was completely suffocated by the heavy, unspoken contract of my childhood. Society constantly drills a very specific narrative into our heads from the moment we are born. They say blood is thicker than water, but they forget that blood can also carry poison. They conveniently leave out the critical fact that sometimes the very people who share your genetics are the ones actively trying to drain the life out of you. My parents and my sister operated under the deeply flawed assumption that biological ties gave them unlimited, unquestioned access to my bank accounts, my peace of mind, and my physical home. They weaponized the beautiful concept of family to justify their blatant theft, continuous emotional manipulation, and profound disrespect. If there is one absolute truth I have learned from surviving their hostile takeover, it is this: never let guilt trap you in a burning building. Guilt is the absolute favorite tool of a toxic relative. They will aggressively strike the match intentionally, set your life on fire, and then cry that you are being incredibly selfish for running toward the exit instead of staying to burn alive with them. When my mother dragged me by the arm in that Chicago penthouse, demanding I hand over my property for the sake of her pregnant golden child, she was trying to lock me inside a burning room. When my father loudly brought up the college tuition he never actually paid for, he was trying to use fake obligations to completely block the fire escape. Walking away from a toxic family dynamic is never an easy decision to make. It goes against everything we are fundamentally taught about loyalty, unconditional love, and forgiveness. But forgiveness does not require you to hand the burglar another set of keys to your life. You can completely forgive someone from 1,000 miles away from behind a legally enforced boundary, and from the absolute safety of a completely anonymous blind trust. True self-preservation requires you to look at the harsh reality of how people treat you, rather than the comforting fantasy of who you wish they were. I used to believe that my success naturally made me a target. I thought that because I worked hard and built substantial wealth, I owed a constant heavy tax to the people who refused to do the same. But financial independence is not a crime, and it is certainly not a free pass for your relatives to abuse you. Taking complete control of your assets, deeply understanding your legal rights, and building a secure fortress around your livelihood are the most empowering actions you can ever take. If you are currently sitting in a situation where your boundaries are being constantly bulldozed, where your generosity is being met with vicious entitlement, I want you to know that you hold the absolute power to completely rewrite the ending of your story. You do not have to participate in their manufactured drama. You do not have to scream or argue or desperately beg them to finally see your value. You simply have to strictly remove their access, remove your emotional availability, remove your financial support, and if necessary, completely remove the physical ground they are standing on. The moment you stop playing by their twisted rules, their entire house of cards instantly collapses. My family thought they had backed me into an inescapable corner. They thought my only options were to surrender my property or endure months of miserable, expensive civil litigation. They never anticipated that I would simply change the entire game. Now I want to turn this over to you, the people watching and listening who might be dealing with their own version of Richard Brenda Cassidy or DeAndre. Your personal situation might not involve a luxury penthouse or a corporate real estate conglomerate, but the emotional theft is exactly the same. Have you ever had to legally outsmart toxic family members to protect your peace? Let me know your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and we are building a community of strong, independent survivors right here. Do not forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more stories of absolute resilience, calculated revenge, and total financial empowerment. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey. And remember, if they try to change your locks, just sell the whole damn house. The story of Natalie and her family's audacious attempt to steal her penthouse offers a profound lesson on the nature of boundaries and the dangerous myth of unconditional family loyalty. Society constantly conditions us to believe that blood ties demand infinite forgiveness and endless second chances, but this narrative brilliantly shatters that toxic illusion. The most crucial takeaway is that true self-preservation sometimes requires absolute clinical detachment. For years, Natalie operated under the heavy burden of familial guilt, sacrificing her own financial stability and emotional peace of mind to rescue her parents and sister from their own reckless, greedy choices. Her family deliberately weaponized her loyalty, interpreting her responsible nature as an open invitation for infinite exploitation. The ultimate turning point of the story was not merely her brilliant, calculated legal maneuver to sell the property out from under them. The true victory was her profound realization that anger and resentment still gave her abusers power over her heart. She learned that the true opposite of love is not hate, but complete and total indifference. By stepping away from the emotional battlefield entirely, she removed the oxygen their toxic dynamics desperately needed to survive. She stopped trying to make them understand her pain or acknowledge her value, and instead focused entirely on protecting her own future. This fundamental shift from emotional reaction to calculated boundary-driven action allowed her to build a genuinely happy life surrounded by a chosen family who respected her worth. We are often told we must tolerate abuse simply because it comes from a relative. But walking away from a burning building is never an act of cruelty, it is a basic act of survival. If you are currently sacrificing your own peace to keep toxic people comfortable, I urge you to take back your power and start building your own impenetrable boundaries today.